So off we go for part two. What is our strategy going to be now? This is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. You have weathered, survived all these different buckets. And with the theme being that each bucket has a completely different explanatory model. And when it thinks it has answered a question, there's another discipline that feels like that's the starting point. All of that, what we will do now is combine all of these approaches in looking at specific behaviors. And in each case, we're going to follow roughly the same strategy. First off, what does the behavior look like? And there will be surprises with it. And then, what was going on in the brain a second ago? Neural activity. What environmental stimuli in the previous minutes were relevant? How about this morning's hormone levels? How about your brain structure, which was influenced over the previous decades of experience? And then back to adolescence, childhood, fetal life, genes, culture, and the role of ecology and the sort of cultures that get invented. And of course, evolution at the bottom of the pile. And what we will see continuously as we apply each of these buckets to these domains, the artificial arbitrary boundaries between the buckets will disappear. Okay, so starting off, this first lecture, the second half, is on sexual behavior and is probably going to last this entire week. First off, I mentioned, and this is in the notes as well, probably not today, but over the course of this week, we will be discussing coercive sex, sex intermixed with violence, the neurobiology of it, the unique aspects of humans with it. Okay, so sexual behavior and its biological bases. So it's basically required by law that I start off with a stupid joke, so here it is. So, it turns out there actually is life on Mars. There's Martians up there, and the Martians come to Earth to visit, and they turn out to be great guys. We hang out with them, and we trade recipes, and we talk about the weather and sports and gossip in each of those, and they're great folks. We're having a great time with them as we all hang out. And of course, at some point, we're all getting familiar enough that both the humans and the Martians can ask the question they've been sort of filing away all along. So, how do you people make a new human? How do you make a new Martian? And it's decided we're going to have a demonstration. So the Martians go first, and first, sort of, they show the humans a whole bunch of diagrams and flowcharts and things like that that they can't understand because they're 5-dimensional. But then it's time for the actual display, and like 4 Martians come into this arena and they stand on top of each other, and beeping lights go on and buzzing sounds. And after about 5 minutes, suddenly out pops a brand new baby Martian. And the humans say, "Oh, that was fabulous. That was fantastic. I can't believe how great that was." And the Martians say, thank you. And now it's the humans' turns. So the humans start off trying to tell the Martians a little bit about the process and saying, you see this couple over there? They're very happy about something that happened to them. So tonight, the man is going to put his penis inside the body of the woman. And the Martian says, okay, does it matter where in the body? And you say, well, yeah, we'll get to that. And then the Martian says, okay, well, after the new human comes, does the man get his penis back? And the humans say, okay, this isn't working. Let's have a demonstration. So this willing couple comes in, and this arena, and the Martians are all around with their iPhones and taking pictures, and a couple goes at it, and eventually they end in this sweaty heap there, and the Martians say, oh my God, that's fabulous. Love the concept. Love the concept. Terrific. We have one question, though. And they say, what is it? And they say, where's the new human? And the humans say, oh, that takes 9 months. To which the Martians say, so why were they in such a rush at the end? And our first question is, so why do we get into such a rush at the end? What is it that is motivating about sexual behavior? Because we're going to see all sorts of beasties, including us, risk life and limb and health and disease and disaster, all in order to pass on copies of genes, our version now, in order to have reproductive sex. Why is it that organisms want to do this? It's obvious, for the good of the species. Okay, so we got rid of that. It's obvious because over the course of generations, those individuals who had sex left more copies of their genes, and thus the behavior became more prevalent because of the genetic component. No, nobody is thinking that in terms of why were they in such a rush at the end. What we're seeing is this contrast between distant causes, passing on copies of your genes, so in subsequent generations, and proximal causes. It feels good. And we are facing the first challenge of reproduction, which is, given how expensive it is, risky it is, and all sorts of costly, metabolically, all of that, you had to have evolved a way in which it is highly, highly reinforcing so that everybody isn't such a rush at the end. So starting off at the beginning, what we see here is this pattern that each individual in a sexual pair, the first one will produce some sort of fixed action pattern. Ooh, ethology bucket, a fixed action pattern. That fixed action pattern will serve as a releasing stimulus to trigger a fixed action pattern in the other individual, which will serve as a releasing stimulus to, and going on back and forth, sort of yoked in that way. And what all the fixed action patterns are about and why they were releasing is sensation is the primacy. We will see just how little your cortex is doing during sex. It's all about the primacy of sensation. And what you get are these chains of fixed action patterns triggering, and on you go. Now, there's a paradox about sexual behavior when you look across different species, in that it is incredibly conserved. You look at mammals, and all the mammals, it evolves like erections and lordosis reflexes and pelvic thrusting and orgasms. Like everybody does that in the mammalian and the animal kingdom. But at the same time, you all have the same basic building blocks. You do not want your building blocks to be so similar to some other species that you can't tell the difference. So, amid the conservation of basic aspects of sexual behavior in mammals, there's got to be species specificity to make sure you don't mess up, since that is bad for leaving copies of genes. And in a number of bird species, briefly stepping away from mammals, we will see that species differ solely on the basis of what some of their courtship behaviors are. You want to have one that nobody is going to mistake you for a warthog when you're actually like a beluga whale or something. So you've got to get specificity, and it could be unique fixed action patterns, or it could be unique chains, these intercalated chains of this triggers this, triggers this, triggers this, but you've got to get specificity coming in there. And of course, above all else, if we're talking about fixed action patterns releasing stimuli, it is very, very unhelpful to study sexual behavior in non-naturalistic settings. So hooray for the ethologists looking at all sorts of mammals having sex. Okay, so as we begin to talk about sexual behavior, and it's going to be a heavy emphasis on humans, we've got to get down some jargon here so you can toss around sex terms like the professionals do. First one is a mostly obsolete term by now, out of date, libido. Libido, a general term sort of related to sexual arousal, and this one is rooted in Freud and psychodynamic stuff, and like people really don't talk about libido much anymore if they are scientists studying this. You get to the scientists, and they have three different terms denoting three very different domains of sexual behavior. First, attractivity. Attractivity, I don't know where the emphasis is, how attractive this individual is to a potential mate. Proceptivity, how much is this individual making gestures, behaviors that hopefully elicits mating behavior from them. And receptivity, how receptive this organism is to the proceptive behaviors that that other one is doing, presumably because that one is feeling attractivity towards this one. So attractivity, proceptivity, receptivity. So that's mostly in the animal realm, and people, and like the rat sex business, will talk about, ooh, this part of the brain is essential to receptivity, but this part is about proceptivity. By the time you get to humans, what is often the case in often in sexual dysfunction medical realm is the dichotomy between motivation and performance. The interest in sex, the ability to do so, to be responsive in males, to have an erection. We will see female equivalents in a bit. And what that generally is now broken down into in everyday parlance is like the difference between desire and once things get going, arousal, and climax, orgasm. So that's great. So what we're going to start off with is looking at some aspects of human sexual behavior. And throughout, the question is it a universal among us? Really key question. And just as key of a question, is it unique to humans? So first, how do you find out about like human sexual behavior? And this seems like, oh, I don't know, kind of an obscure topic or something. This was very important back in the 1940s when Alfred Kinsey started basically sex research. It was very important how you went about getting information because in large parts of the United States, his research was illegal. This, how do you find out about sexual behavior on the part of people, was life-saving by the 1980s and 1990s with the HIV crisis of people trying to, what are people's sexual behaviors like actually? How often, how many partners, with what care, with what recklessness? All, so there emerged a whole science of questionnaires that were randomized to subjects with anonymous responses, and sort of the HIV era. This was pre-online stuff, so there was all sorts of randomization tricks with questionnaires so that you could honestly answer a question which at that time was highly stigmatized in parts of society, all of that. So you ask people. Another version is you see how long they pay attention to something. Ooh, if they're looking this way a whole lot longer than that way, their behaviors just told you something. Implicit behaviors, implicit association test, which we've heard a bit about already, and we will get back to just unconsciously on a fraction of a second level. Where do the eyes go? What is your discordance that you have between who you find attractive and what sort of positive or negative terms are associated with it? Getting that. Then physiology comes in with a machine which I'm going to mispronounce. I never, plethysmography, where what you do is you measure tumescence, how erect is a man's penis, how erect is a woman's clitoris, and there's a whole science to doing that. And you can do brain imaging, and then there's a bunch of techniques where you could look at blood flow, rate of blood flow increasing or decreasing to the vagina, things like that. So we've got some of the tools in hand now. And as we approach this, it has to be mentioned that we are overwhelmingly seeing findings that have come out of studying weird humans. Weird, acronym WEIRD, by, oh God, what is his name? He's the chair of anthropology at Harvard, who noted that a huge amount of what we know about human behavior comes from studying weird subjects. Weird. westernized, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, and how distortive that is. And that has triggered sort of a whole emphasis that, like, all your understanding is whichever freshman in your Psych 101 class have come in and answered a personal questionnaire, you are not finding out about human universals or human behaviors that vary cross-culturally. So this literature has a way bad skew towards weird subjects. So, what are some of the characteristic features of human sexual behavior? The question becomes whether they are unique or not. First off, one of the defining things about humans is we have non-reproductive sex. You look at most species out there, and sex is either most frequent by a wide margin or only occurs around the time of female ovulation. And you will have, like, wildebeest ovulating once a year that afternoon, and they just go crazy at that point, and they don't have sex any other time. It used to be thought that humans were unique in this regard of having non-reproductive sex throughout the ovulatory cycle, whether there is or is not a high chance of fertilization coming out of this. And what has been learned since then is we are not the only species, and bonobos, which we'll hear lots about, do that. Various cetaceans, dolphins, and whales have non-reproductive sex. If I remember, snakes do also, but I don't want to go anywhere near that. So we have that as a universal of human sexual behavior, but not a unique one. Next, one of the characteristics of human sexual behavior is concealed ovulation. You're a primate, and you know who's ovulating. Everybody can tell by some sort of conspicuous sign. Humans are relatively unique in not having overt external signs of ovulation. And you better bet, number one, that's got something to do with sexual behavior throughout the entire ovulatory cycle. And number two, that's got something to do with deception and parental investment and things of that sort. So humans, concealed ovulation. What we will get to in a while is it's not so concealed after all. What it is typically is consciously concealed, but humans have all sorts of implicit cues that they can recognize about somebody's ovulatory state. What else about human sexual behavior? Foreplay, what's called egalitarian reproduction. There has never been a society on Earth in which only the ruler or the ruling class were allowed to reproduce. There were huge skews. There were all sorts of, like, princely options on anybody's wedding night sort of thing. But compared to some other species, marmoset monkeys, for example, in a group of 8, 10 animals, it's only the alpha male and female who are reproducing. Humans, instead, they have never been showing an example of non-egalitarian sex and reproduction. What else? Obviously, we're getting into this whole thing about sexual behavior built around romance and emotions and attachment and all of that. And lots of people have emphasized that romantic love intertwined with sexual love is, like, I don't know, sort of an invention of the Enlightenment. And it did not play a big role before that. And that gave rise to all sorts of these, like, knights back when who had this totally platonic, desperate, romantic love for this lady in her estate or whatever, which had nothing to do with sex, and have sex with somebody or other. The notion that sexual behavior and romantic feelings go hand in hand is, at least in the West, only a few centuries old, not that much more than that, until it has become an expectation for at least some types of sex. Now, related to that, far, far more recent and very much a Western invention in recent century, whatever, is the expectation that the passion of romantic sex and romantic love should be sustained throughout decades of marriage. And that is a very, very new cultural invention in humans, the expectation of that. Okay, what else is unique about human sexual behavior? Maybe, maybe not. The intermixing of sex and aggression, coercive sex, the pathological intermixing in some people between aggression and sexual arousal. And we will see at least one example in another primate where something looking like a whole lot like coercive sex occurs to the male's reproductive advantage. Masturbation, universal in humans, no matter how much they tell you you're going to go blind, and among like a zillion other species, and among baboons, for example, it's much easier to spot males rather than females masturbating. But in terms of frequency, it's exactly who you would expect, which is like adolescent males who are not getting any action, but nonetheless, this is their solitary resource, so that is most definitely not a human unique thing. What does seem to be unique about human sex is privacy. Humans, with very few exceptions, have sex in private, and that is unheard of in any other species. Hidden sex, private sex, no doubt having some connection with concealed ovulation. Fantasy, obviously, humans have sexual fantasy lives, and best estimates are that, like, your average person is spending about 98% of their time sexually fantasize. Is any other species doing this? How are you? They don't fill out questionnaires. How are you going to find out? Nonetheless, I think you can see a little bit of evidence for it. At least one time I saw this, and this is open to some differing interpretations, but there was this adolescent male baboon guy who's sitting there minding his own business, and along comes, if I may use the jargon, the hottest female in the troop. Hottest. She was at her peak of estrus, her largest estrous swelling on her rear end there, pumping out pheromones like there's no tomorrow, whatever. And she comes walking past, followed by the alpha male who is squiring around. And as they pass, our guy, looking at them closely, gets an erection and then turns around and masturbates. I don't know. Maybe he wasn't fantasizing. Maybe it was the pheromones wafting over that was doing this, but, that might be a most parsimonious explanation in our primate continuum. What else about human sexual behavior, intersexual affiliative, bonding stuff, all that? Kissing. Kissing. The best evidence is kissing is at least 5,000 years old among humans, and that is based on sculptures, artwork from back when showing evidence of it. And we are not the only species. Other apes, particularly chimps, particularly bonobos, kiss all the time. Chimps, same-sex chimps, kiss a whole lot as a means of reconciling after tensions. Bonobos, everybody kisses everybody, and we will see how that goes hand in hand with like every conceivable type of sex is occurring in the bonobos. That kissing. So, is kissing a human universal? Kissing in the context of romance and sex, as opposed to mother-child or father-child? And it is not a universal. Only about 45% of human cultures on Earth have romantic sexual kissing. There's a correlation with that, and I have no idea what to make of it. But as you have more complex societies, more stratified, you've gone from simple hunter-gatherers to city-states with role specialization, all of that, the more stratified the society, the higher the likelihood that there's romantic kissing. Make of that what you will. I have no idea at all. Now, in terms of surveys about kissing and how important it is to you and how important it is in mate choice and maintaining a bond and all of that, I don't know if this is surprising or not, but what study after study shows is females are way oriented, more oriented than males towards kissing, desire for that as a hallmark of forming a close relationship, that kind of thing. So, what is kissing about anyway? How did it evolve? And it seems like there's two explanations that float around out there. One is like breath. Breath, are you smelling someone whose breath indicates that they are diseased? You were smelling, you were getting gustatory cues, all of that, finding about the individual's health and finding about out about the individual's state of fertility. Okay, what else about human sexual behavior is interesting? Homosexuality. It is universal in every human society out there. It is punished beyond belief in some of them. Do not go to Uganda these days, which makes gay sex punishable life in prison. I think the parliament there just passed under the wonderfully democratic orders of their glorious leader there. Uganda, East Africa, highly stigmatized. It's very hard to find out the incidents because it is so punished in so many societies. Nonetheless, it is clear that that is a human universal and has been for a long, long time. So, where do we fit in same-sex attraction into the realm of human sexual behavior? And we're going to first pass, it's a new novel flavor for reinforcing the status quo. The binary nature of sex, the binary nature of sexual orientation, whether you're attracted to your own kind or the other kind of way, you're only attracted to one. It is a strict dichotomy, a binary feature to human sexual behavior and sexual attraction. We will see how much that is not the case. And that is our new emerging world, which obviously was always there, but is only now recognized and documented in the vaguest sense of numbers of sexual fluidity, bisexuality, pansexuality, omnisexuality. I could list there of terms I've never even heard of half of those words before, and I'm not sure if I want to know, but tremendous fluidity there. Tremendous fluidity implicit in that is breaking down the strict dichotomized, you're only attracted to one sex. In some humans, it's the same sex as the person. In most humans, 80%, 90%, the numbers are very squishy. It's the opposite, but you are only attracted to one sex, and sex is highly dichotomized. It is binary. And then this whole world of recognizing fluidity in that and people's sexual behavior and people's sexual attraction on a continuum between the two extremes. Now, there's been an interesting sort of political, socio-political controversy with bisexual behavior in recent years. My very indirect assessment of that literature suggests it's calming down a little bit, but when bisexuality suddenly became much more openly discussed, claimed, all of that, I don't know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, unexpectedly, there was a strong backlash from the gay community. The gay community still working with a dichotomized model there. The gay community working with these people are not really bi, they're just faking it. When they're saying a woman who's saying I'm attracted to both women and men, she's actually gay. She's a lesbian, but she's dragging her feet about declaring it or uncomfortable with it. So she's covering it up with, oh, and I'm attracted to men as well. And that as a people who are dragging their feet as opposed to people with the confidence, the freedom, the privilege, whatever, to declare where they are on this binary thing. And what is clear from science, looking at what sort of sexual stimuli increases blood flow to the clitoris or the penis, which all of that, what is clear is, as a general rule, people who say they are bisexual show the physiology of being aroused by both sexes. There are skews. There are some people who are skewed in one direction versus the other versus right in the middle. Nonetheless, it is a real category from the standpoint of physiology interesting, just sort of socio-political thing that there was pushback from the gay community about this. Don't say you're bi, stop being chicken and sort of being wishy-washy about it. Come out and admit who you actually are. All of these intermediate versions appear to be for real. When you look at somebody's sexual history over their lifetime, what you see is on the average, women are far more likely to have experimented in the sexual continuum than males are. That is quite reliable. Okay, so that gives us a first pass at what the behavior looks like. And what we're starting with now is what's going on in the brain, not when you were a fetus, not when you were hitting puberty, what's going on in the brain in the time right before and right after sex. So we start off with the most obvious thing on Earth, which wasn't all that obvious back when, which is the limbic system is involved. Whoa, revolutionary. Back in the 30s, Kluver and Busey combined to discover the Kluver-Busey syndrome, which was the first evidence that when you did damage to what we now call structures in the limbic system, you got all sorts of sexually inappropriate behaviors on the part of rats or monkeys or whatever. And this was right around the time that it was first occurring to people that, this part of the brain, maybe it's not just interpreting olfactory information. That was a key observation in the rhinencephalon emotional limbic brain wars going on. Kluver-Busey syndrome. Obviously, in the century since then, far more insight into particular areas of the brain. Focusing first on hotspots for sexual behavior that are pretty much unique in one sex versus the other. Females, overwhelmingly, it is focused on a part of the hypothalamus called the ventromedial, ventral bottom in the middle, the VMH. The VMH, ventromedial hypothalamus, is central to female sexual behavior, both arousal, both motivation and performance. How is this shown? Stimulation techniques, lesioning techniques, all the stuff we know about by now. Huge whopping amounts of receptors for estrogen and progesterone and all the usual suspects there. So that part is absolutely critical. And in contrast, the male VMH is this like ignored little outpost that doesn't seem to have anything to do with anything. I'm sure that's not actually the case, but nonetheless, this is the center of brain regions that are specifically central to activation in females during sex. A whole bunch of midbrain structures having to do with regulation of breathing rate and heart rate. And okay, there seem to be some sex differences in that which we will hear about, differences in the time course of changes in heart rate, breathing rate, autonomic nervous system. And in females, not just in ovulating rats, but you have the involvement of the spine, the spinal reflex, the lordosis reflex, which is very dramatically the case in some mammalian species. In humans, it is there, it is less pronounced. And unlike somebody bopping you on the knee in the doctor's office and your leg kicks out, the lordosis reflex is estrogen dependent. It is working in the spine to cause this reflex. When there's pressure on the flanks, you trigger the lordotic reflex in pretty much every mammal out there. So those are the female hotspots inside the brain. And the male hotspots, another part of the hypothalamus, and this is called the medial preoptic area of the hypothalamus. We will only call it MPOA for the rest of time because all of that. And we're going to eventually see there's some very interesting sex differences and differences by sexual orientation about aspects of the medial POA. So that is there very much for performance. How do you tell performance versus motivation? Saying in a lab rat, you got a male and there's a female in the next room and he knows it. How much is he willing to press a lever to get the door to open and go into? How motivated is he? How proceptive are his sexual behaviors? And once the door opens, what's his actual sexual behavior at that point? What is his performance? Medial preoptic area is all about performance. So you damage it, and you still get the male rat is just as interested in getting in there and gets in there with a female and wants to think about stamp collecting or something. All the usual evidence, as with the VMH, lesion studies, recording studies, stimulation studies, huge whopping amounts of receptors for testosterone and related hormones, so that's involved. Okay, so each sex gets one hypothalamic nucleus that they specialize in. Then we get into some very interesting terrain. What do we know about the amygdala so far? Fear, anxiety, aggression. And along with that, in males, the amygdala is central to sexual motivation. Huh. Motivation, back to our lab rat, you put the guy in the same cage with the female and like they'll mate, he'll perform, this is doing its thing. But he could not care less if it's going to cost him like one lever press, any sort of work to get in there. Amygdala is about sexual motivation in males. And at this point, one can either have a field day talking about what this is teaching us, that the part of the brain that is most central to aggression in males is most intermixed with sexual motivation, or you could decide, oh, this is just another behavior in the amygdala's portfolio. We will see there's much reasons to believe that in a very pathological subset of humans, the amygdala being about aggression, the amygdala being about male sexual motivation, get very, very intermixed and like tragically confused. Okay, so we've got these areas that are much more female specialization and much more male specialization. Now we get to the parts of the brain and the autonomic nervous system where both sexes are equally centered around functioning there. First off, erections. Male erections in the penis, female erections in the clitoris. Male erections, there's all sorts of species differences as to whether it's done by increasing blood flow to the penis or whether there is a penile bone that has some muscle extends, contracts, and pulls the thing up. We are blood flow erective humans, and other primates, rats, have a penile bone, whatever. Okay, so you have engorgement in humans, engorgement with sexual arousal of the clitoris in women and the penis in men, and essentially the same underlying physiology having to do with the autonomic nervous system. And in both sexes, the sort of similarities between arousal, engorgement, all of that, and eventually leading to orgasm, it's the same circuitry. In order to be sexually aroused, in order, best studied in males, to have an erection, you've got to turn on the parasympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic, calm, vegetative, unstressed, unanxious, all of that. So hooray for you, you've established your parasympathetic tone. And what happens now over the course of sex is like your heart's starting to beat a little faster and your breathing rate and your muscles are working and all of that. And more time goes by and you eventually get to this point where your sympathetic nervous system is turned on in every outpost in your body, except while you desperately try to hold on to parasympathetic tone in the penis. Finally, you can't take it anymore. The parasympathetic shuts off, the sympathetic boosts into action, and you have an orgasm. So that's how orgasms work in males. That's how orgasms work in females. And it's the exact same physiology of the autonomic nervous system with a few interesting differences. First difference, the realm of sexual dysfunction. When you look at male sexual dysfunction, the most common issue in terms of arousal, erection, orgasms is this whole process occurring too quickly. And you might consider in that context what happens during stress. You have trouble getting an erection in the first place because parasympathetic, you gotta be calm and vegetative. And if you're stressed, that doesn't happen very readily. And the other is either you have problems getting the erection or you have accelerated switching to sympathetic tone, premature ejaculation. Those are the most common problems in males, particularly accelerated premature ejaculation. About 60% of the doctor's visits in this country from men complaining about erectile dysfunction. Premature ejaculation is the one that is relevant in there most often. About 60% of the cases are related to stress. Stress making it difficult to establish parasympathetic tone, or stress accelerating the transition to sympathetic. In the majority of men, the best studies indicate it is mostly psychogenic as opposed to organic. Okay, something useful here. How do you tell the difference between a case of organic erectile dysfunction in a guy and psychogenic? Guy comes in, says he hasn't been able to have an erection during sex for the last 8 months or whatever, and you're thinking, maybe it's stress related, or maybe he's got a pituitary tumor, maybe there's something wrong with his hypothalamus, maybe there's a spinal lesion, whatever. How do you distinguish between the two? You take advantage of a very weird thing that male primates do, which is when they go into REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, they get erections. Primates get REM sleep erections. I have no idea why. I've talked to Earth's penis experts. Nobody has a good evolutionary explanation. Male primates get erections during REM sleep. And it's this automatic reflex thing. So you've got this guy sitting there who's saying he hasn't had an erection for months. Is it psychogenic? Is it a tumor? That sort of thing. And what you do, or what they used to do in the past, is they'd give you this handy dandy little penile pressure cuff transducer thingy that the guy takes home, and before he goes to sleep, he puts it on the base of his penis and wires it up and plugs it in and gets the right website to send it by satellite to 24-hour operators or whatever. And what you see is, did the guy have an erection when he went into REM sleep? There's a slight complication there, which is you've got this device and it's beeping and the little lights going on and off, and you're so sure it's going to electrocute you with the wiring there that that's stressor in and of itself. This is what is done in the majority of sexual dysfunction clinics in the country. You take a string of postage stamps and you lick them at one end and you wrap it around the guy's penis. And then the next morning, if the stamps have been torn loose, the guy had an erection during the night. Can you believe how elegant that is? Engorgement, and it busts the stamps loose. And this is like $4 and you can get a lab result sort of thing, even though insurance never reimburses you for the stamps. That sort of thing, showing that the realm of male difficulties is most commonly accelerated orgasm premature. In the female end, the much more frequent problem is delayed orgasm, delayed turning on of the sympathetic nervous system, delayed as in resulting in a low frequency of orgasms, never experiencing orgasms, all of that. So the exact same circuitry with very different sorts of vulnerabilities. Next interesting sex difference in terms of this autonomic profile, which is, hooray, you've had your orgasm. And the question is, how long does it take for your sympathetic nervous system to go back to normal? And there's a sex difference with this. One of the sexes, it goes back down like this. And in the other sex, it takes much longer. If we were live in the classroom right now, I'd ask for a show of hands as to which sex you think is which. Who has the much slower recovery time? Who has the recovery time that's like 2 seconds later, it's all over with, completely forgotten? Males have a much faster recovery time, and females, unlike all those cliches that afterward she wants to talk about love and romance and he wants to go out and get, you know, pad thai or something, and very different speeds of turning off. We will see when it comes to aggression, after an aggressive act, men turn off far more quickly than women do, so a sex difference there. How well that is understood is not shared at all, is not clear at all. So now we come to the incredibly important question, which is, why do females have orgasms? Why do females have orgasms? Because men need to have an orgasm 90% of the time or more than that for ejaculation. It is not an absolute requirement, but it is close to absolute. And females do not need to have orgasms in order to be fertilized, in order to get an egg fertile. Why do females have orgasms? So we first look culturally, we put on our ethology hat, and yes, all sorts of other species, primates, females have orgasms. And you now ask an interesting question, whether looking at the fact that only some female baboons, for example, have orgasms, and only some women have them readily, easily, where the individual difference is coming from. And you look at the baboons, and it's got nothing to do with the female's social rank. Orgasm is not a perk of being a high-ranking female baboon. It's got nothing to do with where you are in your cycle. Are you ovulating, or is it a day before or a day after? It's got nothing to do with which guy you're with, whether you're hanging out with the alpha male or the new squirrely kid who just showed up. It is seemingly an intrinsic trait. Some female baboons are more prone towards orgasm than other female baboons. And the best guess is in primates, there's something anatomical that begins to explain the differences we will see. There's some heritability to it, identical twins, all of that. And you look at humans, and it's the exact same thing. Despite what males may self-satisfyingly think, it's got very little to do with who the person is that you're with. Orgasm becomes much more likely in women when it is non-casual sex. It becomes much more likely during the follicular stage when you are heading towards ovulation. But most of all, individual differences seem to be intrinsic. Women simply differ as to how prone they are towards orgasm, and it is not fully understood. No doubt it's got something to do with this, but it's got something to do with anatomy as well, as the best guess. But that doesn't solve our problem of why do females have orgasms? And all along, there's been all sorts of theories and a little bit of evidence. There's been theories where, in fact, it's adaptive. Females do not need to have orgasms in order to be impregnated to reproduce. However, some evidence that it makes it more likely. First concept, the notion that orgasm, it is known, increases the flow of all sorts of vaginal fluids, and there's some evidence that such fluids cause sperm facilitation. Make sperm swim faster and longer, so hooray for the sperm. There's good evidence that the pelvic paroxysms during orgasm goes directionally in a way that will push along the sperm a little bit faster there. There's this post-coital exhaustion notion, which is, an orgasm leaves you in such an exhausted state that you just got to lie down there and you're horizontal instead of vertical, and that sure helps the sperm get along there instead of having to go up, and all of these notions where it is in fact adaptive. Then there's the notion that orgasm in females is just a holdover, a mammalian holdover, in that you see in a lot of mammals, you get reflex ovulation. You ovulate in response to sex, And that seems to have something to do with this. All sorts of ungulates have reflex observations, ovulation, rabbits have that sort of thing. So maybe it's just a leftover with humans. That seems very implausible. Reflex ovulation is not a primate sort of specialty. But then there is the possibility that female orgasm is just a spandrel. It's not there for any purpose whatsoever. Males have to have an orgasm, and we've got evolutionists to tinker all of that. Okay, so we could take apart the whole orgasm physiology in these females who don't need it, or what the heck, the males have it, is carried along as a spandrel in females, and that's just what it's about. It's got nothing to do with anything. It's just a spandrel. And it's around this point, if we were in a classroom, that I would ask for a show of hands by sex as to how plausible people think that female orgasm is just a spandrel kind of thing. And after we get through the vote for that, we could then have an equally interesting conversation as to why do males have nipples? And is that just the spandrel? And, so that's a persistent question. Why do females have orgasms? And there's pretty good evidence suggesting that it increases reproductive success. It facilitates sperm moving and not fighting against gravity, all of that. So maybe that's telling us something. What it is not telling us anything about is why clitoral orgasms, and that gets into a whole world its own. And it is clear bonobo females will have orgasms from clitoral stimulation. What's that about? If like vaginal orgasm is somewhat mysterious as to why it's there, that much more so. Okay, so we've got the physiology of the autonomic nervous system. It's exactly the same in males and females. It's really different in males and females. What else? What else is shared in terms of the neurobiology of sexual behavior? Yes, you guessed it. The reward, the pleasure, the anticipation, and thus we have just parachuted into dopamine world. Yep, you should be able to recite by now. Yes, in part is we're involved in reward and pleasure, but anticipation and motivated behavior and uncertainty boosts up dopamine like crazy, maybe. And this is a realm where that sure happens in terms of sexual behavior. All right, so when you are having that burst of dopamine related to sexual behavior, whether in anticipation or in response to anticipation dominating all of its ventral tegmentum, that site in the limbic system, its nucleus accumbens, and it is going all over the place. And there is lots of reasons to think that the ventral tegmental dopamine projection is where sexual motivation is coming from. Telling you again, it's mostly about anticipation and not reward. So, in that context, what does dopamine do in terms of sexual behavior? And lots of monogamous pair bonding species, it strengthens the pair bond. And insofar as we're confused a mixture of tournament and pair bonding, it enhances pair bonding, romantic sense, closeness to your partner, all of that. And we will be getting to the role of dopamine in species that are clearly pair bonding monogamous and species that are clearly tournament, the different roles of dopamine in there in an evolutionary context. So, we've got the ventral tegmentum, nucleus accumbens, the whole world of dopamine in there. Next brain region, anterior cingulate. Anterior cingulate up in the cortex. Anterior cingulate, we heard something about that in the limbic cortical interaction lecture. Anterior cingulate, psychic pain, empathy, feeling someone else's pain, all sorts of, and you see a transition. Get a bunch of subjects, stick them in a brain scanner, and you show them their beloved, the person in whose arms they want to die, who they just met 2 weeks ago, and you show them a picture of them, and dopamine lights up, and opioid pathways in the limbic system, all of that. And then you get somebody where you show them the picture of the person they've been waking up next to for half a century, and its activation of the anterior cingulate. There's a transition from evoking the sense of arousal, anticipation, and all of this stuff to, over time, it evoking comfort on and off on the level of a nice cushion, old familiar couch, but something along the realms of reading somebody else's emotions, empathy, connection, and attachment, all of that. Now we get to the frontal cortex. And it's obvious there what the frontal cortex is about. It makes you do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. And we already have a model for this, which is frontal cortex is sending a projection down to the limbic system to all of these structures, and especially the amygdala and male motivation, and doing its usual thing of saying, I wouldn't do that if I were you. You're going to regret it. Don't do it. I know it's tempting. Hold off. Go study some obscure subject instead. Stop thinking about it. What the frontal cortex is about is constraining sexual behavior. That's the easy interpretation. But some of the time, it's about exactly the opposite. It's about motivating you to do the harder thing when it is the evolutionarily right thing to do, even though you're scared out of your wits. For example, you are a male baboon. You are seeing some female who is ovulating. She is an estrus. She is in a consortship with another male who's a little bit higher ranking than you. And what is often sort of your challenge to work up the nerve to go and challenge the guy, to take him on, to try to drive him off and take over the consortship. We'll eventually get to what the female thinks about this, but just for the moment, frontal cortex is telling you, like, you really need to do that. Frontal cortex fueled by anticipatory dopamine. That dopamine mesolimbic cortical projection, that's giving the frontal cortex sort of the anticipatory oomph and backbone to say, this guy is scary as hell, but I am going to go threaten him. Or I'm a salmon and I'm going to leap over dams and all of that. No, it would be so much easier to just stay here. And very often, frontal cortex is not about constraining sexual impulses. It's about overriding stress, fear, and pain in facilitating sexual behavior. What's happening in the frontal cortex, especially the prefrontal cortex, during orgasm? You guessed it, it turns off completely. It goes totally silent. No surprise, the only time where it's as silent is when people are dreaming and REM sleep, so all of that makes a great deal of sense. But now what we get to intertwined with the brain regions is hormones. What's happening to hormone levels right afterward? This is not what did your hormone levels this morning have to do with it. This is not what did your hormone levels when you were a fetus. This is overwhelmingly about hormone secretion and the aftermath. This is not about what hormones have to do with increasing or decreasing the likelihood of sexual behavior, the motivation, performance aspects, any of this. What's happening in response to having sex? And what you see in females is there's a rise in estrogen immediately after. More importantly, there's a rise in progesterone. And we're going to see why that makes a whole lot of sense when you're looking at hormone levels over the course of an entire cycle. But sex tends to cause a rise in progesterone levels. Oxytocin in females, very obviously related to things like pair bonding and closeness and satiation, sexual satiation. Raising a female rat's oxytocin levels makes her less likely to try to elicit, to act proceptively towards another male in the aftermath of having sex. More satiation. Meanwhile, at the male end, testosterone goes up, of course, and this was a major dead end in the field. A major dead end along the lines of, well, we just saw this guy have sex and let's take his testosterone levels and let's, get him to pee right now or saliva or blood sample, whatever. And whoa, I bet you we're going to see a correlation. High testosterone levels in guys, they're having a lot of sex. And this gave rise to the completely erroneous direction of causality, the notion that high testosterone males have sex more often. What you see in every species out there is it's the other way around. Sex increases testosterone secretion in males, so you're seeing the correlation because the behavior is driving the hormonal secretion, not the other way around. And we will see a realm where that is becoming so important when we get to the aggression lectures. Vasopressin. Vasopressin in both sexes is secreted in response to having sex, and in both sexes it increases facilitating pair bonding and closeness and emotional connectiveness and that sort of thing. And if it sounds like vasopressin and oxytocin are having some very similar roles, that's because 100 million years ago, they were the same hormone, something called vasotocin, the ancestral form. And out of our molecular biology lectures, somewhere along the way in mammalian development, there was a gene duplication of the vasotocin gene, and one of them drifted into being vasopressin, and the other drifted into being oxytocin, with somewhat overlapping, but not entirely overlapping, effects on behavior. Now we're getting to issues of, do you see differences in vasopressin and oxytocin responses to sexual behavior in people in stable relationships versus casual sex? All of that, the literature is very muddy on that. Right off the bat, individuals being on the autism spectrum, there is a high degree of heritability, but be suspicious because there's genes involved, but probably less than people would first say. But there's a high degree of that, and there's been identified a few families that have a very, very high rate of autism spectrum disorder among their generation sort of things, where it turns out there's a mutation in the gene for the receptor for vasopressin. Something about sociality, ease of it, need for it, maybe telling us something about why males are more analytical with little islands of cognition rather than holistic integrators in females. Maybe the subset of families that have been identified with vasopressin receptor gene mutations, maybe it is tapping more into the affective, the socialization aspects of autism spectrum. Okay, so we've just gotten through all of this, and let's celebrate. And what we shift to now is what's going on in the environment in the seconds, minutes before this activates, or this doesn't, or this gets delayed, or this gets sped up, or the hormones get secreted. What are the environmental cues, stimuli that are pertinent in the minutes, seconds to minutes, or hours before sexual behavior? And of course, what this is all about is different sensory systems. Visual stimuli. Humans are overwhelmingly a visual species in terms of sexual arousal, but there's interesting sex differences with that. Males are more responsive to visual stimuli than females are on the average. Is this human specific? No. An amazing study published in Science some decades ago, absolutely amazing. So male macaque monkeys, and they had to work. They had to press a lever for access to a treat or access to orange juice or something that macaques like. And what they showed was that male macaques would be willing to work, would put an effort, were motivated to see photographs of female macaque monkey crotches during estrus with estrus swellings. Can you believe this? Pay-per-view male monkeys motivated to do work to get visual sexual stimuli of female macaque sexual organs during ovulation, and this is pretty remarkable. And a striking similarity to the human male orientation towards visual stimuli for sexual arousal. So immediately you've obviously asked me, what about the female monkeys? Are they going to pay to get to see this guy, how well hung he is or something? The females were totally disinterested. They were just interested in getting the orange juice or the grapes or raisins or something male-specific phenomenon. In humans, a skew in the direction of males. So, visual information, what do visually sexually arousing stimuli do? Exactly what you would expect. Activate here, here, and here in females, activate here, and especially here in males. Makes perfect sense there. Next sensory realm, tactile stimulation. This one is a bit of a duh. That stimulation in some parts of the body are very predisposing to all this brain stuff happening. And what you see is big differences in different parts of the body in terms of sensitivity to stimulation, sexual stimulation, erogenous zones, and that old term, and you could find this on an actual level of density of sensory receptors in different parts of the body, but most importantly, sensitivity of those tactile receptors to hormone levels. And what you see is in both females and males, you have increased sensitivity in the genitals and secondary sexual areas, increased sensitivity when estrogen levels are elevated in women, when testosterone levels are elevated in men, and there's all sorts of stuff having to do with receptors for the hormones in that tissue there and making the neurons more responsive to stimuli, all of that. So that is fairly well understood in terms of a hormonal element. One other realm where tactile is obviously very important is females with the lordosis reflex. It is in response to tactile stimulation on the rump there. So that's a more specialized one. Okay, so some parts of your body are more sensitive to arousing stimuli than other parts. Those parts that are more sensitive are especially more sensitive when sex hormone levels are elevated and when, for reasons of some medical complication, it is necessary to remove somebody's gonads and sex steroid levels drop down. Both sexes report far less pleasure from tactile stimulation, far less responsiveness, and people look electrophysiologically and less responsiveness in terms of blood flow changes, things of that sort. So that plays a role. Next sensory system, the greatest one of all, maybe if you're human, but it sure is irresistible. Odors, odors, pheromones. We know about pheromones already. They carry information about whether these are two brothers or eight cousins, and olfactory molecules, which carry huge amounts of information about sex and sexual status and things of that sort. And note right here that olfaction, smelling, we are getting an element of that in kissing, odors, breath odors, that whole sort of thing. So pheromones, odorants, having something to do with it. So we ask a number of questions. First off, what goes into generating sex pheromones, the construction of these molecules? And you see something that's like not at all surprising, which is sex steroids, estrogen, progesterone in females, testosterone in males, promote the production of sexual pheromones in basically every mammal looked at out there. And where there are characteristic glands in the body where sex pheromones are released from, around the genitals, around the anus, around the armpits, all sorts of secondary sexual sites, things of that sort. And they are predominantly, their generation, driven by sex steroid levels in the bloodstream. What is interesting is when you go do the chemistry and isolate the actual odorant, for example, a sexually arousing pheromone in rodents for either sex, and look at the structure of the molecule. And what it very often is It's derived from estrogen or testosterone. You just did a couple of biosynthetic changes there, and now it's an estrogenic pheromone or an androgenic one. This is not, oh, estrogens and androgens promote the biochemistry that makes whatever that pheromone thing. This is glands, secretory glands, odor glands for releasing pheromones, doing minor modifications of sex steroids to produce the pheromone itself. And this winds up explaining all sorts of interesting things as follows. Initially paradoxical, but years ago there was this sudden controversy that burst out in terms of animal protection and industrial testing of animals, where it turned out one of the great secrets of the perfume industry is that a lot of perfumes contain sex pheromones from male cats, musk-like odorants. And the biggest surprise was Chanel #5. I have no idea if that still exists, but that was very classy back then. And not just from any cats, but from Abyssinian cats, that they would get sweat and glandular secretions from the male Abyssinian cats and put it into their Chanel #5 vat there at the factory, and that was part of the attractiveness. Okay, so this is puzzling. This is puzzling because we are going to, in a while, see that pheromones derived from males can decrease testosterone levels in males. Smell aversive. Wait a second. So perfumes that women put on contain musk androgenic type scents, male pheromone sort of smells, but males are not going to be attracted to that. That seems totally paradoxical until you look at the literature, the market, all of that, and perfumes. Perfumes are overwhelmingly bought by women for themselves, responding to the odors of that. And males generally find musk-based perfumes to be certainly not pleasant and often highly aversive. Okay, so sex hormones going into generating pheromones. Does the amount of, say, sex hormone that you're releasing, if you're a female rat, is that a function of just how high your estrogen levels are? Nah, pretty much. If you have no estrogen and no testosterone at all, less sex pheromone release, dramatic decrease. But after that, individual differences in levels don't tell you a whole lot about how many pheromone molecules are being released per unit time. So that's the generation of pheromones. Next, we move to the perception of sex pheromones. And what you see is pheromones in general and all sorts of other species, including primates, carry information about the age of the individual, whose pheromones you're smelling, their health, that kind of thing. Then you see the ones that are telling you reproductive information. Most obviously, what the sex is of this rodent that you are encountering, or this other chimp you were encountering. What is the sex status of that individual? What pheromones also carry is a whole lot of information about the fertility state of the individual, where you have a different perception of pheromones coming from females and rodents when the females are ovulating and when they are not, telling you information there. Women can detect differences in male sweat, which map onto how high of testosterone levels the guys have. So perception with that. Interestingly, perception is also hormone driven as follows. You take women and you ask them, like, are these the same smells or are these different ones, and which do you prefer, and that sort of thing. And you see that consistently there's a preference for pheromones from high testosterone males rather than zero testosterone males, all of that. But the preference for it and the detection threshold, the ability to pick it up, peaks around the time of ovulation. Women, when they are ovulating, not only are better at detecting testosterone-related pheromones, but they have a stronger preference for them. How does that work? Cyclic stuff, estrogen, changing things about the engorgement of tissues in your nasal cavity, and thus how many pheromones are getting in and processing in the olfactory system, all of that. So perception of sex pheromones is hormone dependent. And males' classic studies were always the same punchline, where they could armpit swabs from women volunteers at different points in their cycles and put the little cotton ball into a mason jar and had all these male test subjects, and they would sniff them and got to rate how pleasant the smell was. And what you saw was, number one, yes, males were rating armpit swabs from women when they were ovulating as more appealing than from other points in women's cycles. But here's the one which was the big shock. They weren't being rated as more appealing. They were being rated as less unappealing. On the average, men reported themselves to smells as being aversive in this study. What I think that suggests is this is a very different context than some other aspects of the world. Presumably, Timberg and Lorenz and von Frisch at that point would note that a little mason jar containing a cotton ball with armpit sweat on it is not all that ethologically meaningful. Females prefer the smells from men who are high testosterone. Men prefer the smells of women who are ovulating. What about sexual orientation? And this used to be a non-existent literature, and it is much more fleshed out now. And what it shows is in gay people, on the average, they find high steroid hormone-laden pheromones from their own sex to be more appealing than from the opposite sex. It maps out, making perfect sense there. So, what are some of the effects of these sex hormones on physiology? And in a very, very broad way, you've got this matrix here. When female mammals are smelling female pheromones, it tends to suppress reproductive physiology, drives down estrogen levels in species that reflex ovulate and makes ovulation less likely. It extends the follicular stage of cycles if you were smelling that. So female on female. How about humans? And this gave rise to, for my money, this tragic disappointment, the Wellesley effect, first reported in 1970, the finding that when you put female roommates together over the course of freshman year, they synchronize their cycles, it's pheromone-based, the more socially extroverted individual tends to synchronize the other one, and it was the best. It was totally cool, not least of all because Hillary Clinton was of the graduating class at Wellesley that year. Research done by Martha McClintock, her senior thesis while there, now head of behavioral sciences, University of Chicago. The Wellesley effect, totally cool, and I would babble on about it at great length right around here in these lectures. And what's become clear in the last 20 years or so is if there is a Wellesley effect of cycling synchronization between two women living in closer proximity to each other, if it's there, it's a pretty weak effect. There's been a ton of trouble replicating this. There was one interesting sort of wrinkle in it, that it is not so much physical proximity as much as emotional and social proximity with synchronization. Nonetheless, it has turned out to be a pretty wimpy sort of effect, and lots of people don't think it's there at all, but it sure was irresistible at the time. And I remember when I was in college, like people would be sitting around the dinner table saying things like, "Whoa, when we roomed together this weekend, I had her synchronized by the beginning of August." Social extroversion, social dominance, that was part of this is what happens when you hang out with biologists at dinner. But in general, the mammalian pattern is female pheromones are anti-reproductive on females, delays the onset of puberty, in addition to some of these And to the extent that that's the case in humans, does synchronization count as an arrow going downward? And how reliable is the synchronization effect? Very piddly evidence in this realm. How about when the male is the source of pheromones, female recipient, and what you have is increased estrogen levels in rodents, accelerated onset of puberty, increased likelihood of fertilization, ovulation. So this makes sense. In humans, the effects are there. They're very, very slight. What you see is an interesting sociobiological thing playing out there straight out of our evolution lectures. So you are a female rat and you smell a male, and that makes you more likely to ovulate unless this is the pheromone of a close male relative. Ooh, inbreeding avoidance. You see female rodents smelling female sex pheromones and it suppresses the reproductive system unless, ooh, it's a close relative, it's kin selection, out the wazoo, all of that. So pheromones, they're the coolest, they're the best. Whether they actually exist in humans is highly controversial in the olfactory cabal. And the people who even say it does exist have been very, very sort of pressed to show any strong effects there. Now, switching over to female pheromone sources, male recipients, and what is fairly solid in humans and other primates and rodents and such is it increases testosterone secretion in males. Now we have the effects of male pheromones on male recipients of it. And back to the Chanel #5 complication in terms of they are generally viewed as smelling aversive. What you see in some species, a first exposure to male pheromones boosts testosterone levels. Territorial challenge, getting all worked up there. You're about to have a big fight, you and the next hartebeest over there who's like dripping his pheromones all over the place. Chronic exposure to male pheromones generally seen as decreasing testosterone levels in rodent species, not so much in primates, delaying puberty onset, that sort of thing. Humans, very, very weak evidence for it, if any at all. Key thing is that this is not universal chart in terms of preferences or responses to humans. It is what you see in heterosexuals, and in people who are gay, you see a very different profile, basically things flipped around amid these being very, very weak trends. I know zero literature at this point about sex pheromone effects, perception, preference, all of that in sexually fluid individuals, bi, etc. I have no idea if anything has been done on that. So what is clear is sexual secretions, vaginal secretions, gonadal around males, all of that from human males, primates, non-human primates sure as hell like those smells. And the chemical makeup of them is basically the same mixture of steroid-derived odorants there. And there are endless stories in terms of captive primates, when the male rhesus monkeys, when the person who is feeding the monkeys each day comes in and is female in responsiveness when she is ovulating versus not. It is clearly read in other primate species. In us, the evidence is very, very sketchy. Okay, next sensory system, gustation, taste. What is that about? We already know by way of kissing, that's one way of getting, saliva as being a sort of reservoir of pheromonal type stuff. So that's a source. Where you see some striking things is a lot of other species, a lot of ungulates, where you see this bizarre behavior, which winds up making perfect sense, called flemening. Flehmening, some German zoological term, where you see, like, you encounter an individual of the opposite sex or the same sex and you've never seen them before. And what do? You go up to their like private parts and you sniff there and you lick there and it's gaining information and dogs are doing it. Flemening is in a subset of ungulates where the process of males licking at female vaginal areas and secretions, they're licking there, are fixed action patterns for eliciting sexual receptivity in the female. Auditory cues. We already know some examples of this. We've got stag, moose things, moose, I don't know if they're elk or whatever, who males give calls miles away that will cause reflex ovulation in females. You've got the whole world of mating calls in lots of different species, and all you need to have is like a cat in the neighborhood who is in heat, and you know all about auditory cues of sexual attractivity and receptivity around the time of ovulation. Female pitch in voice tends to rise, and males in general, whether we are talking about rhesus monkeys or panda bears or humans, have a preference for higher pitched voices around the time of ovulation. There's interoceptive information coming from in your body. And one of the striking findings there, which is cool as hell, is when people are hungry, they become more responsive to figures of individuals who have higher BMIs than they would be at the other time. You are more responsive to heavier figures there, and signals coming in there makes perfect sense. Of course, all of this is in the context that by the time you get to us, our most erogenous organ is our brain, thought, all of that sort of thing. What does thought cognition have to do with it? Every time you can read a novel and be aroused or something, you were showing how much that is a cognitive phenomenon in humans. Environmental stimuli. Chronic stress suppresses sexual behavior in both sexes very dramatically in humans, in males in the form of erectile dysfunction, in females in the form of loss of motivation, arousal, decreased likelihood of ovulation when the stress is physical, like starvation. Nonetheless, concentration camp studies, which carry their own very heavy ethical baggage, showed that nonetheless it takes a remarkable amount of starvation for women to stop ovulating. So chronic stress, dietary stress, caloric stress. What you see is acute stress can be a stimulant for sexual behavior. And this is intertwined with one of the most like reliably awful things that human males do, which is in moments of rage, in moments of battle, sexual arousal and coercive sex and rape and things of that sort, and that as central to like military strategy, mass rapes throughout history kind of thing. But stress is sort of suppressive of reproduction. Raping someone in the middle of battle has nothing to do with reproduction. It is all about power asymmetry. Final thing, the coolest environmental stimulus out there is variety. Variety in species after species, including us, when you see sexual satiation, where there's so much post-coital whatever, that arousal is blunted, having a different partner is arousing. And this is the source, obviously, of more misery in relationships out there. That variety, whether a male rat who has just mated to exhaustion with this female, when a new female is put in, variety in that form, or variety in the form of extra partner sexual behavior in humans, it is very reliable as an arousing thing, and obviously a cause of massive amounts of human troubles over time. Final deal with that. This effect, the stimulatory effect of variety on sexual arousal, is called the Coolidge effect. Coolidge effect, named for Calvin Coolidge, who is the most obscure, uninteresting person who's ever been president. There is nothing interesting he ever said, no anecdotes about him, except as follows. the basis of the Coolidge effect. So it seems as if President and Mrs. Coolidge were visiting a chicken farm and they were taken around for a tour of the place separately. And Mrs. Coolidge came up to the area where they put in breeding males with the female chickens and looking at the male mating there. And she said, "Oh my God, he does this all day." And they said, "Yeah, it's easy. For the male chickens, they can have sex 50 times a day." And she said, "Do me a favor, when Mr. Coolidge gets here, tell him about that." So she goes off, and along comes Mr. Coolidge, and they show him that this male who could mate over and over and over, and he says, "Is that with the same female?" And they say, "Oh no, they switch females after each mating." And he says, "Do me a favor, tell Mrs. Coolidge about that when you see her." That's it. That's Calvin Coolidge anecdotia, and we will thus pick up tomorrow on what's going on with hormone levels over the course of hours to days on sensitivity to and the brain.